welcome to the Weisberg Commons. So nice to see that students, in fact, can show their faces at 9:30 in the morning on a Friday. Very impressive. And to all our guests, I want to acknowledge Moshe Strauss, who's here, and Erwin Shapiro, a member of our Board of Trustees. It's always an honor to have you, and I'm sure I've now insulted 17 other people who are here. Oh, excuse me. And of course, Dr. Kupiecki, who is a longtime friend of Yeshiva, and many of you. Thank you all for being here. Only one thing in introducing, first of all, also with a great warm welcome to Lady Elaine Sacks, who is every bit a full partner to her husband in their journey towards sharing Torah with the world. You know that in my State of the University address this year, I began to refer to the mission of Yeshiva University as being a university that has Torah in conversation with the world. Long before I said anything like that, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was in fact modeling Torah in conversation with the world. And as he continues his chief rabbinate for another year, and then proceeds to be an important voice as a public intellectual in sharing the message of our people with us and with the world, it's always critically important for us that he views and we view Yeshiva University as his home. But this is a place where you're charged with doing what he teaches. And not only what he teaches, but through the Strauss Center, it is exactly that kind of mission, led by the inestimable, prominent liberal thinker, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. Without any further ado, we have a wonderful program today, and I'm not going to intrude on the time. So it's my pleasure to give you the director of the Strauss Center, Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik.
Thank you, President Joel, for everything, not just an introduction, but your very warm support and encouragement, and for your friendship, and also for what I take now as a political endorsement as well. I appreciate it. I appreciate everything. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the second in our series of great conversations this academic year at the Zahava and Moshe Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought, focusing this year on philosophy of law. My very tremendous gratitude goes to my partners in this endeavor, Zahava and Moshe Strauss, and to President Joel. Thanks, as always, to our Assistant Director for Operations, Dr. Stuart Halpern, for making this event happen. I want to welcome all the students here today, and I want to take note, first, of an honors course that we're organizing for next semester on civic versus religious identity, to be taught by a young scholar now finishing his PhD at Princeton in philosophy of law by the name of Daniel Mark. It will also feature, which many of you know, it'll feature some input from myself, as well as prestigious visiting scholars. I want to welcome the many high school students who are here, from MTA, Frisch, Mayanot, Shalhevet, and I want to take this opportunity to let you know about the exciting summer program that the Strauss Center, together with the Tikva Fund, will be organizing at Yeshiva University and at Yale, where my cousin is apparently, and flyers about the program and how to apply are available at the entrance. The Strauss Center's mission is to ponder the uniquely Jewish message that we as Jews are able and obligated to communicate to the world. Today, to ponder the Jewish notion of justice and the legacy of the trial of Shakespeare's Shylock, we welcome back to the Strauss Center the most prominent Orthodox intellectual voice on the world stage today. When I had the honor of being invited to speak at the Chief Rabbi's High Holiday Conference before Rosh Hashanah in London, on my last day, I was given a tour of the House of Lords, of which Lord Sacks is a member, by another Jewish lord. And he mentioned to me that when he first became a lord, you have to choose a location over which you will be a lord. Hence our guest today is Baron Sacks of Aldgate. Is that an estate, Chief Rabbi, or that's
For those who think it sounds extremely grand, I ought to explain that Aldgate is our equivalent of the Lower East Side.
Okay. Well, that's now a very trendy place, actually, the Lower East Side, Chief Rabbi. So this Jewish lord, when you choose a location, he told me this, can you pick a location outside Britain over which to be a lord? Someplace that he was thinking of somewhere in Israel, somewhere that you had a family connection. So suppose you wanted to be, let's say, Viscount Soloveitchik of Volozhin, something like that. So are you allowed to do that? So he was told that the only way that you're allowed to be a lord over a foreign city outside Britain is if you've conquered that city. If you've sacked that city, then you can be a lord over that city. Oh, Sacks, that's right. That actually gets to exactly what I wanted to say. Thus, Viscount Allenby, General Allenby, who conquered the Holy Land, was Viscount Allenby of Megiddo. Now, we may have Baron Sacks of Aldgate, who has not, in a military sense, conquered outside Britain, but our guest today has certainly conquered the minds and hearts of many thousands of individuals, Jews and non-Jews, far beyond the borders of Great Britain. He is a sophisticated voice of Jewish faith that has earned the ardent admirations of adherents of many faiths. And to illustrate this, I'll conclude my introduction by quoting one of my own teachers, Princeton professor Robert George, one of the most prominent Catholic intellectuals in America, who wrote as follows several weeks ago. Last night I had the joy of getting together with my esteemed friend, Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was at Princeton to give a lecture. His talk was characteristically brilliant. Religion, he wrote, is ubiquitous in human society, but religious geniuses are rare. Britain, said Professor George, an officially Anglican nation, produced a Catholic religious genius in Queen Victoria's time, John Henry Newman. It has produced a Jewish religious genius in ours, Jonathan Sacks. In his exemplary humility, said Rabbi George, the chief rabbi would be embarrassed by the comparison, but it is, in my opinion, fully warranted. He is a teacher of people of every faith, and even those who, for now at least, are without faith. Speakers who come to Princeton often say they are honored to be speaking at our university. In this case, said Professor George, the speaker truly honored the university by his presence. End quote. For our discussion today, we too at Yeshiva University's Strauss Center are honored to welcome Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Chief Rabbi, we're going to begin, if it's okay. I'll begin by rehashing for non-Shakespeare enthusiasts the details of this case, what Shakespeare would call the Rashi Prakim of Shylock versus Antonio. A Venetian gentleman by the name of Bassanio wishes to woo a wealthy woman named Portia, but he has no money. So he goes to his friend Antonio for a loan. Antonio responds that all of his money is tied up in his ships, but as their arrival is imminent, he'd be happy to guarantee Bassanio's loan from the local moneylender in Venice, a Jew by the name of Shylock. Shylock hates Antonio because Antonio has treated him terribly. Says Shylock, quote, "You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own." Antonio replies that he plans to continue to treat Shylock the Jew this way, and says Antonio, "If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends, but rather lend it to thine enemy, who if he break, thou mayst with better face and exact the penalty." And so Shylock proposes what he calls a merry bond. If Antonio cannot pay, then Shylock can collect from Antonio an equal pound of fair flesh to be cut off from his body. Antonio's ships do not return, and Shylock comes to court demanding the pound of flesh. Portia, disguised as a judge, shows up and pleads for mercy in one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. And he says, and I apologize for the lack of a British accent, she says, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy. Shylock refuses. Portia then turns the tables by arguing that according to the letter of the law, Shylock can claim a pound of flesh but no blood, which is of course impossible. And if he actually sheds one drop of blood from a Gentile, which Antonio is, he is then chayav misa himself. He's liable for capital punishment. And his property would go to the state. Shylock then replies that he'll take the money instead, but too late. Portia says, the Jew shall have all justice. He shall have nothing but the penalty. Antonio himself then says that Shylock's life should be spared. but only on condition that he convert to Christianity, and that after his death, all of Shylock's property go to his intermarried daughter and her Christian husband. Ad Khan, Shakespeare. Chief Rabbi, you wrote regarding Portia's speech, quote, Shakespeare is here expressing the medieval stereotype of Christian mercy, Portia, as against Jewish justice, Shylock. He entirely fails to realize, how could he, given the prevailing culture, that justice and mercy are not opposites in Hebrew, but are bonded together in a single word, tzedek or tzedakah. The false contrast, you wrote, the false contrast between Jew and Christian in The Merchant of Venice is eloquent testimony to the cruel misrepresentation of Judaism in Christian theology until recent times, end quote. So Chief Rabbi, let's begin with the question. What is unique about the Jewish approach to tzedek, to tzedakah, to tzidkus? What's unique about it that the typical distinction between justice and mercy misses?
Before I do that, man, I want to unpick this because it's a crucial moment in Western civilization. And don't worry about not speaking with an English accent. Portia being Venetian didn't speak with one. So number one, I mean, let's just knock this on the head. Number one, in a famous essay, two famous essays, the late Shai Zevin Zatzal, editor of the Encyclopedia Talmudit, wrote a couple of articles on Mishpat Shylock. So that particular contract cannot exist in Jewish law because we have no ba'alut on our bodies. They belong to our Kodesh Baruch Hu. And therefore, you cannot make a contract of the form that Shylock made, and Shylock being a religious Jew would have known. So the whole thing falls to begin with. Secondly, Portia and Antonia, talking about mercy, are in fact, especially Portia, merciless. Because as soon as she's pointed out that he can't take his blood, he immediately tries to settle and is repeatedly refused. And Portia argues very much like somebody who learned Gemara for several years, you know, so she argues in what Elizabethan England would have seen as a casuistic way. And she is merciless. He's guilty of attempted murder, all his property has to be seized and so on. And so, although she is wearing the mantle of compassion, she is absolutely heartless. Number three, Antonio, who shows mercy on condition that Shylock converts to Christianity. Now, we have a slight problem with that kind of mercy. Number four, she is quoting both linguistically and conceptually quintessentially Jewish ideas. The quality of mercy is not strained, it falleth as the gentle rain from heaven is, of course, an allusion to Moshe Rabbeinu's great song in Ha'azinu, Yarof Kamata Likhi Tizal Katal Imrati. The concept of compassion at the very heart of the ethical life comes from Sefer Shemot, the Yud Gimel Midot Rachamim, Hashem Kel Rachum V'Chanun. When Christianity talks about God, the Old Testament God in their phrase, as a God of justice and vengeance, whereas ours is a God of love and forgiveness, the whole concept of love and forgiveness comes to Christianity through Judaism. Number five, the principle that if you want compassion from God, you have to act compassionately to human beings, is itself an axiom of Jewish law. Ha-mavir al midotav, mochlin lo kol avonotav. If you want God to forgive you, you have to forgive others. And hamoseh din al chavero hu ne'enash tchila. If you propose strict justice against your fellow, God will exact justice from you. So all this stuff that Portia says, the language of it, the logic of it, the sentiment of it, is all Jewish. So we have here an extraordinary illustration of the power of stereotype to corrupt even the greatest. So let us now ask the question, was Shakespeare anti-Semitic? The answer, clearly no. Is The Merchant of Venice an anti-Semitic play? The answer is clearly yes. And all the more so because Shakespeare is the world's great humanitarian, and therefore anti-Semitism is given credence by the sheer power of this play. And there are two contrasts here where we can see. Contrast one, which Stephen Greenblatt gives in his wonderful book on Shakespeare, Will in the World. The first contrast is between Shakespeare and his contemporary Christopher Marlowe, who wrote an anti-Semitic play called The Jew of Malta. And the first contrast is between that and The Merchant of Venice. Christopher Marlowe presents an entirely stereotypical, heartless portrait of the Jew, whereas Shakespeare, his humanity shines through and almost breaks through the anti-Semitic stereotype. You know, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew ears, if you prick us, do we not bleed? All that kind of stuff. So the anti-Semitism here has to be set against Shakespeare's great humanity, which suggests that I would suggest we take up the other contrast between Shakespeare and Rembrandt. Rembrandt is living in a Holland that had by then welcomed Jews, abandoned anti-Semitic theology, and Rembrandt paints his Jews with love. I don't know if you know this. Rav Kook was stranded in England during the First World War. He hated it. He really hated it. He knew my great-grandfather on the shoulder. They were buddies at that time. But he says, the one nachama, the one saving grace was, he used to go to the National Gallery and spend time looking at the portraits of Rembrandt. And he said about Rembrandt the following, that the light HaKadosh Baruch Hu created on the first day wasn't physical light, because that was only created on the fourth day. It was spiritual light, which he gave to tzaddikim in every generation. And Rembrandt said, Rav Kook said Rembrandt was one of those tzaddikim, and in his paintings you can see the light of the first day of creation. So you have here Christopher Marlowe just buying into the stereotype, Rembrandt already free from the stereotype, and Shakespeare in the middle. And that is what's so troubling about the play. Because here you have a humanitarian every bit as great as Rembrandt, but imprisoned in this negative vision of the Jew. That makes sense? Now you want to know, now I can answer your question, if I could remember what your question was. What's distinctive about the Jewish concept of tzedek? The Rambam takes, in the Moreh HaNevuchim, he rises to a climax in Book 3, chapters 53 and 54. In chapter 53, he devotes that chapter entirely to an analysis of three words, chesed, tzedek, and mishpat. He says mishpat is legal justice, giving somebody what they are legally entitled to. Chesed is the opposite. You are giving somebody something that they are in no way entitled to. And tzedek is the mediating concept of justice tempered by mercy, of mishpat tempered by chesed, and that's the definition he gives, which I think is very beautiful. And then in chapter 54, he says that, you know, it's an analysis of Jeremiah. Al yitalel chacham b'chokhmato, haskel b'yodati. And he says the highest of all perfections is to know God. And then he says, once you know God, then you've got to go back in the world and do tzedek, mishpat, and chesed, ki ba'aretz, ki be'elech afatztinu Hashem. And you have to practice these three virtues in the real world, because the Rambam says knowledge of God shouldn't force you to retreat from the world, but to engage in the world with justice and compassion.
So, if tzedek, which is perhaps the supreme virtue, is a combination, justice mediated by mercy, mercy mediated by justice. So, what does that say about the unique Jewish approach to virtues? In Christianity, love is placed on a pedestal as the greatest virtue of all. God is himself identified as love. Reflecting on Portia's speech, you also wrote as follows, quote, "Why then is justice so central to Judaism? Because it's impartial. Law as envisaged by the Torah makes no distinction between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, homeborn or stranger. Equality before the law is the translation into human terms of equality before God. Judaism is a religion of love, but it's also a religion of justice, for without justice, love corrupts." So from the perspective of Jewish thought, is it a mistake to place love supremely on this pedestal? Can we say that for Jewish thought, in contrast to Christian theology, love can be a virtue but can also be misplaced, and it's no more central a virtue than other equally important virtues for Judaism?
I think I want to recommend a book here. It came out last year. I didn't write it. Very nice book, should just be published, or it's just published in paperback in Britain this year, by a philosopher in Britain called Simon May, and it's called Love, a History. And he writes in this book, and it's very important that somebody says this, not from a Jewish perspective. He says, if love has a history in the Western world, its foundational text is the Hebrew Bible. And that's very important, should be said by somebody who's not Jewish. And of course, it does. I mean, take that for granted. In the New Testament, when love is mentioned as a virtue, it is in two forms of love. The founder of Christianity, he says, what are the two foundations? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Love your neighbor as yourself. He's quoting psukim from Chumash. He fails to quote the other pasuk, which I think is even more important. Ahavat Hager. The Chazal say that only one place in Torah we're commanded to love our neighbor, in 36 places we're commanded to love the stranger. You know, your neighbor is quite easy to love, isn't he? I mean, he's like you, not yours.
Depends on the neighbor. Yeah.
Depends on the neighbor. But stranger is hard, and there is not the kind of emphasis in Christianity on the love of strangers as there is in Judaism. But I want to say a chiddush here. I mean, I haven't road tested it. This is the first time I ever said it, and I may be wrong.
I plan to steal at this Shabbos, Chief Rabbi.
It's all yours. I actually ask the following question. Why, if we have Bereshis, do we need Shmos? Why, if we have the Ovos, do we need something more than the Ovos? And I am going to suggest that one theme of Bereshit is the inadequacy of love as a foundation for society. And I'm going to brag here because it will take too long. Akedas Yitzchak, Kach et Bincha, Yechidecha She'ahavta. The first time the word love is mentioned in the Torah, if I'm not mistaken. Let's bracket that one. The Akedas Yitzchak is a chapter in itself. But what do we see? Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav Kitzayit B'fiv V'Rivka Ohevet et Yaakov. That love, a father to one son and mother to another son, creates one of the great discords in history. Number two, Yaakov loves Rachel, finds himself married to Leah. And listen to what it says. Vayehav Yaakov gam et Rachel. So we think that's great. He loves her as well. So love is okay. And then we read the next word, which is mi Leah. He loved Rachel more than Leah. And what is the next thing we see? Vayah Hashem ki senua Leah. It never says Yaakov hated Leah, but it says God saw that Leah was hated. In other words, if you love two people, but you love one more and one less, the second person feels that they are rejected. Are you with me? So Jacob's love creates division between Rachel and Leah. And then we have his love for Yosef, ki ben Zgunim Hulal, which creates the whole drama of would-be fratricide, of selling Joseph into slavery, and so the whole... So you understand that Bereshit has as an overall theme, love creates conflict. How do you resolve that? Only by creating a nation governed by the principle of justice. So I think Bereshit is actually a commentary on the inadequacy of love. It has to be tempered by justice.
One of the courses we're running now through the Strauss Center is a reading group at Stern College studying the writings of one of Britain's greatest 20th century religious writers, C.S. Lewis, who has a lot to say, obviously, on love, wrote a book, The Four Loves. And we read it side by side with classics of Jewish thought, especially from the Rav Zatzal. In his book, Reflections on the Psalms, writing hundreds of years after Shakespeare, Lewis is reflecting on a parak in Tehillim, which we say every Shabbos, which is talking about how delightful and delicious the Torah is. Torah is Hashem Tamima Meshivas Nafesh. It's sweeter than honey. Mitzubim Midvash Venofes Tzufim. Now, Lewis is mystified. He writes, I can understand that a man can and must respect these statutes and try to obey them and assent to them in his heart. But he doesn't understand how they can be exhilarating. Now, in the case of the Merchant of Venice, what's being set up is also the dichotomy between Torah and grace, between law and mercy, between Shylock and Portia. So how would you explain to a non-Jew, whether it's a religious Christian or to a reader of Portia's speech who's not religious at all, that for us, this dichotomy is not the same? That for us, Ahava Rabbah can be about the Torah. That the mitzvos are a sign of divine love. That for us, love and law are intertwined.
Mitzvot are the expressions of God's love for us. You cannot see law. You cannot understand what is a mitzvah without understanding them. The mitzvah is Hashem's gift of love to us. It's his ketubah, his marriage contract with us. And every mitzvah connects us with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That goes without saying. Christians could never really understand. Mind you, it's a pretty long thing to try and understand. It's our War and Peace of Sefer Tehillim,
Right.
which is a love poem on Torah and mitzvahs. And they never understood this, and they should. The idea that law is a vehicle of grace, because when we in civil society, when we in a contemporary secular nation state keep a law, that law is impersonal. It comes from we the people, some anonymous something or other. But when we keep a mitzvah, that is an I-thou relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't have I-thou relationships in secular law in America. We have in England, because I suppose we're doing that for the sake of Her Majesty, and I suppose so, but it's a little remote. No, clearly law here, it goes hand in hand with love. And it is designed to correct. As I said, love is always partial, law is always impartial. It's to create fairness in society. However, it might be of interest to you for me to tell you a story, because it was one of the most remarkable moments in my life, I have to say. Once, there's something called the Church of England.
I've heard it.
You've heard of it, yeah, known for it. So, and there's something called the Anglican Communion. Are you familiar with the difference? The Church of England is in England. The Anglican Communion is worldwide. It's huge. And once every 10 years, the Anglican Communion, that is all Anglicans worldwide, come together once every 10 years, and it's called the Lambeth Conference. We have 800 bishops from all over the world and otherwise. And in 2008, for the first time, as the church was about to split apart, so they thought, well, let's make it worse. Let's ask the chief rabbi to create a new model, I guess, which will distract us from the other model. Anyway, in 2008, they asked me to become the first rabbi ever to address them in a plenary session. What did they want to know? They wanted a shir on covenant. Because covenant holds people together who are in danger of splitting apart. So I give them a shir on covenant. I think you can see it on the web. I think it's on YouTube. I speak for 45 minutes in front of these 1,500 Anglicans. They give me a standing ovation, and then they say, would you answer questions? Big mistake. So I say yes. And a bishop gets up I repeat, in front of all the Anglican bishops in the world. And he says, tell me, Chief Rabbi, what do you think about Jesus? Now, what do you say, guys? Jesus who? And your life passes by you in a split second.
I've never gotten that question during a shir.
Now listen, and you know what I heard? As in that split second, when I was deciding what do I do, I heard all the Jews throughout history who were persecuted by Christians. The Jews of England expelled in 1290 and from there across Europe until 1492 Spain, 1497 Portugal. And I said to myself, up there in heaven, they want me to say something down here on earth. And so this is the answer I gave them. Because bear in mind, Merchant of Venice, that long-lasting millennial Christian insistence that Christianity is a religion of forgiveness, but Judaism is only a religion of law. And I said this to them. I said, I'm not going to answer your question in general. I am going to tell you the most Jewish thing Jesus ever said. And it was these words, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That is Jesus' great statement on forgiveness. Now, I have not seen this annotated in any Christian Bible I have ever seen. I said, you don't know that that is a direct paraphrase of a line from the 15th chapter of Bamidbar, which we say at the beginning of the holiest night of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish day of forgiveness. And it says this, V'nislach l'chol ha'am, ki l'chol ha'am bishgagam, which means, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And there was a gasp. And I hope we got our message across to every bishop in the world that Christianity got its forgiveness from Torah. Not from the New Testament, but from us.
You mentioned before one of the brilliant essays from Rav Zevin on Shylock, Mishpat Shylock La'or Halacha, where he argues, as you mentioned, Chief Rabbi, that a Jew not only would not have made such a deal, placing a lien on someone's flesh, but that he would never have even considered that halachically possible. Because for Jewish law, we are not owners of our own bodies. We cannot lease our bodies, we cannot sell our bodies. Our bodies, as our souls, belong to God. As we say on Yom Kippur, Haneshama lach v'haguf shalach. So the whole idea is entirely different. Yes, pa'alach, and then shalach. So while the halacha would agree that Antonio might owe Shylock money, it would never say that he owed him flesh. It's impossible. Now at the heart of this is, first of all, the Jewish notion of human inviolability, because we're created in God's image, which is similar to the secular notion of rights. But Judaism also believes, because we believe that our bodies are not ours, that we don't have a right to do whatever we want with our bodies. If I asked you, Chief Rabbi, to punch me in the face, you could not do that. Yes. That would make some great Strauss Center promotion. That would go viral on YouTube like nobody's business. Yeah, and that's not my gift. The Chief Rabbi can put it to music after. Yeah. But you can't. You couldn't. And if I wanted to hit myself, I couldn't do that either. Chovel ba'atzmo is usher, because I don't own my body. I have no right to my body. I have no right to do what I want with my body. Now, one of the ways in which we illustrate, perhaps the primary way, that we are bound to God, not just in soul but in body, as Jews, is through Milah, which is, if you note, circumcision, which, as you've noted, is once again under attack today. Only now the attack is taking a secular approach, focusing on individual autonomy and human inviolability and human rights. You've written that an assault on Jewish life always utilizes justification from the highest source of authority at that particular time. So in the Middle Ages, it's the church, and Judaism becomes law versus grace, etc., etc. Today, anti-Judaism is cast in the language you wrote of human rights. Now, the debate over circumcision burst forward in Germany, in Europe. We saw in San Francisco.
Yep.
This is not the beginning of this. And the question then becomes, what is the most effective way to counter this new version of anti-Semitism that utilizes now, again, the legal terminology of individual autonomy and human rights?
Well, look, and in practical terms, I'll tell you what we're doing. I'm forming helping to form a new organisation for the global defence of Brit Mila in Britain and Europe. I sent an open letter to Angela Merkel on this subject. I went to address the Dutch Parliament, which had banned Shkita. And I said to them, these are the words I use, I then pulled back. I said, Holland was the place where in the 17th century European religious liberty was born. Don't let it become the place where in the 21st century European religious liberty died. That's what I said to Holland. However, I'll be blunt with you, in Britain and in Germany and Switzerland, the Jewish communities are so small that, obviously you do the ADL type stuff, the defense type stuff, but, I believe in long-term planning on this. And therefore, it's been a matter of principle to me over the last few years of developing an alliance with the Catholics on this, because they are also, even the Anglicans, but especially the Catholics, being hit. For instance, their adoption agencies have now been denied government funding because they refuse to put out children for adoption to same-sex couples. So they're facing a similar battle, and I've made an alliance with them, and I have defended the Catholic Church in several op-eds in the London Times. And this is the argument I use, that there are, in fact, people don't know this, because it's only mentioned by J.L. Talmon in his book Totalitarian Democracy, and Hayek in his book The Constitution of Liberty. There are two fundamental traditions of human rights in Europe. Number one is the Jeffersonian concept of human rights. That is, that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights and unlimited liberty and pursuit of happiness, which sees rights as a limit on the power of the state. You can't sign those rights away because they're things that don't belong to you, like your body. So you can't sign them away, therefore they can't be part of a social contract, therefore the state cannot intrude. And on this, rights are seen as limits on state action. There is the other concept of human rights set out in the first paragraph of the French Revolutionary, Les droits de l'homme et de citoyen in 1789, which says all men are born equal and equal in rights. And that is an invitation to a maximal intrusion of the state. Here, rights are a template of an ideal world, and it's up to the state to implement it. So you have a French tradition which sees rights as a license for government intervention, and you have the American conception based on John Locke, which sees rights as a limit. So you've got maximalist governments, minimalist governments, and there is no question whatsoever that the classic British and American tradition is minimalist state intervention, which puts freedom of religious worship much more than the rights of a child, let's say, on bodily operations. And when you do that, you're not just defending Mila, you're defending British and American culture. And the general public can respond to that. Whereas if you're only defending Brit Mila, that's called special pleading.
And so this is an issue that will affect all traditional and religious communities.
100%. I actually said in the House of Commons Select Committee that I reminded them that certain people, Puritans, set sail on the Mayflower in 1620 because England was not guaranteeing them their religious freedom. And I said, you carry on the way you're going, and we'll be chartering a new Mayflower. I might even land up here, Richard.
A kosher cruise across the pond. We'd be delighted to have you, Chief Rabbi. Over the past summer, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London hosted an international Shakespeare festival featuring acting groups from countries throughout the world, each performing a play from Shakespeare, but in the language of their own nation. Habima, the National Theatre of Israel, performed The Merchant of Venice. Now, the New York Times reported that, quote, across the 5 weeks of the Globe to Globe Festival so far, a mind-bending sequence of productions from around the world in as many different languages as there are Shakespeare plays, 37. The atmosphere has been one of inclusion coupled with fun. But come the first of two performances on successive nights of The Merchant of Venice, and spectators were met with airport-style security, advance notices of conditions of entry, and a note by the box office informing patrons that certain items which could be thrown, in other words, would not be allowed into one of London's most beloved theatrical addresses. The performances, wrote the Times, one of which you attended, Chief Rabbi, were interrupted by pro-Palestinian protesters. Habima's performance was publicly protested in advertisements by well-known members of Britain's theatrical and acting community, including Emma Thompson. Meanwhile, performing countries whose human rights records no one protested, who also featured Shakespearean plays, include China, Russia, Tunisia, and Iran. So what does this tell us? That a good 4 centuries after Shylock was first jeered in the original Shakespeare Globe Theatre, it wasn't called Shakespeare's Globe Theatre then, anti-Semitism is still alive and well at a performance of The Merchant. And what were you thinking as a British Jew when you were experiencing something which Shakespeare could never have imagined? Shylock, The Merchant of Venice, being performed in London in Hebrew by a modern, flourishing, artistic Jewish society.
You can imagine there were a lot of emotions swirling around. Number one, just to sit there hearing The Merchant of Venice in Ivrit, and knowing that despite all attempts of every civilization you can think of to destroy it, Am Yisrael Khan. And not just Am Yisrael Khan, but 2 absolute miracles that have no parallel. Number one, a nation being reborn as a sovereign state after 2,000 years of exile, coming back and being reborn in the land of its birth. And number 2, no less miraculous, the fact that you go back 1 century before Shakespeare and you read that English, it's a foreign language. No English person today can understand that language of 500 years ago. Whereas here they are speaking essentially the language of the Bible, and the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language is an equally unprecedented miracle. So there was a lot of sense of pride. In the audience, there was a big sense of pride, I have to say. That's number one. Number 2, of course, certain things hit you in translation. You know, when you're listening in Ivrit, you're hearing something. Suddenly, it hits you how hard it is. No Jew could ever say words. And the critical moment, because in the actual Shakespeare's play, this happens in reported speech, but in the Habima theatre, they actually showed the action of Shylock coming back and finding that Jessica has left. And he's lost his daughter. She's run away.
With a Gentile.
With a Gentile. And of course, with some of his money. And what does he say? My daughter. Oh, my ducats! He's more worried about losing his money than about losing his only daughter. And that just, it's like I felt wounded all over again. And number 3, the protests. I mean, they weren't huge, but what a painful reminder. Anti-Semitism does not die, because anti-Semitism is a virus and it mutates, and I've written about how exactly it's mutated in our time. But it does seem to me that this time we have to take a stand. You know, I mean, showing we really have to carry this out. We have to stay with it and continue to show what an outrage it is when human rights are in serious doubt throughout the Middle East, when nations are tearing themselves apart, where Israel is the only country in the Middle East where it's safe to be a Christian. And yet Israel has been condemned by the European churches. I mean, we have to fight this one, and we really have to fight it hard. The persistence of anti-Semitism within living memory of the Holocaust is perhaps one of maybe the most shocking thing of my life. But Zayavor, I mean, I don't want to upset you all of a sudden, especially Erev Shabbos will win, but it is nonetheless shocking.
So, building on this point about the persistence of anti-Semitism, one of the things I found fascinating about The Merchant of Venice is the fact that Shakespeare, who didn't really know Jews, is assuming that a Jew would be filled with hate. Why? Because he is treated so badly by others, however justified that mistreatment might have been for Shakespeare. Shylock in the play says, "The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I shall better the instruction." In other words, Shakespeare, having never really met a Jew, takes it for granted that Jews were rapacious, bloodthirsty, vengeful, because that's how they were treated. They would act like animals because they were treated like animals. Shylock also says, thou calledst me a dog before thou hadst a cause, but since I am a dog, beware my fangs. So to me, the interesting question is, reading or watching this play, how did we not, if this is an untrue picture, and of course it is, how did we not become like Shylock? How are we able to say, day after day, V'lim kalai nafshi sidon? How did we not let ourselves become vengeful, rapacious, given how we were treated? What was our secret to experiencing centuries of hate and not becoming Shylock?
Habibi, let me explain something to you. This is one of the most remarkable phenomena in history. Max Weber, in his Ancient Judaism, called Jews a pariah people. The biggest miracle, to my mind, in all those long centuries, between Churban Bayesheni and Tkumat HaMedina, is the fact that we never internalized that self-image. Why? Because we defined ourselves by reference to our reflection in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, when we looked in the mirror, what did we see? They saw we are the people loved by God. And not all the insults and injuries of the Gentiles could affect them. What happened in the 19th century, tragically, as Jews tried to assimilate into German and French society, they suddenly stopped defining themselves by the image they saw reflected back from God. They started defining themselves in terms of the image they saw reflected back from their Gentile neighbors. And they stopped being the people loved by God, and they became the people hated by Gentiles. And that's when they began to try and divest themselves of every single thing that makes Jews different. Kashrus keeps it different, let's abolish kashrus. Gittin make us different, or Kiddushin make us different, let's have civil marriages. Shabbos makes us different, let's move it to Sunday. That whole assimilationist streak of 19th century German Jewry was the most tragic thing imaginable, and people very early on, Moses Hess already in 1862 was pointing out that this would never work. And therefore, it seems to me that the really miraculous thing is that you do not find any negative self-image in the Jewish literature of the Middle Ages. And what do you find in the Kinot, which are that literature of the Middle Ages? You know, Rabbanu Shalom, you know, we're crying, answer us. You know, all their conversation is between us and heaven. It's not at all between us So they live among Gentiles, but they didn't define themselves. And that was our source of strength, and we must never ever lose that. Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom means you just look at a Kadosh Baruch Hu and you will see him smiling back at you, and that will give you inner peace.
The final subject that I want to raise, and I've been pondering this really since you told me, Chief Rabbi, about seeing Shakespeare in Hebrew, not just Shakespeare, but Merchant of Venice. And that is the tension between Judaism and art, and especially when that art is something like the Merchant of Venice. I wondered what it must be like to see that in Hebrew, whether it's better in Hebrew translation, like the Yiddish version of Shakespeare. Right, verteidigt verbessert, translated and improved. Right, exactly.
Yeah, zu sein und nicht zu sein, this is the catch.
Yeah, I often share with people, actually, Chief Rabbi, that I'm working on a Yiddish version of Beauty and the Beast, which I've tentatively titled Shena and the Behemoth. It's going to be a big hit. But you've noted a real tension, especially with art that actually makes the case for something which we find repellent. Shylock is, on the one hand, the merchant is an object of fascination, even Jewish fascination. People don't realize, if they don't read the play, that Shylock doesn't appear that much in the play, and he's not the Merchant of Venice. But he has become one of the most fascinating characters in English literature, and has been played in the Yiddish Shakespeare theater throughout its history, and now taken up by the Israeli theater. Now, you've noted the tension between Judaism and art. That Judaism, this is in many of your divrei Torah, that Judaism stresses ideas rather than visual artistry, the verbal rather than the visual. We place intellect over the image. That is the big clash, perhaps, between Jerusalem and Athens, Judaism and Hellenism, which relates, of course, to Hanukkah, Haba Aleinu L'Tov. So how ought we as religious Jews engage in the world? You mentioned Rembrandt, how that can affect someone's Yiras Shamayim. How ought we to approach art that may be brilliantly done, but still violates our values? Shylock, Merchant of Venice, in the words of the author John Gross, quote, invested with Shakespearean power and in time with Shakespearean prestige, Shylock, the Jewish villain, became part of world mythology. He may not have added anything to existing stereotypes, but as the most famous Jewish character in literature, he helped to spread them and to keep them vigorously alive. He belongs inescapably to the history of anti-Semitism, end quote. And yet, as Gross notes, and as I just mentioned, it became a character played by Jews in Yiddish, in English, and now in Hebrew. In Israel now, they argue over whether to play Wagner in his compositions. So, as we prepare now, once again, to mark the clash between Judaism and Hellenism, how would you, speaking to students, given the opportunities but also the dangers, what would you tell these students? How should they approach the enriching aspects of art while guided by the boundaries and the philosophical principles and the loyalties of Judaism and the Jewish people?
Look, I mean, there are several 80,000 word books here. You can't ask bigger questions. Number one, you touch on a fundamental difference between Greek and Jewish sensibilities. Greeks were a people, a culture of the eye, of the visual arts. And they have left their legacy on the English language, on Western civilization. So what do we use for words meaning understanding? They are all visual metaphors. We talk about insight, foresight, hindsight. You make an observation. You adopt a perspective. You have visionary thought. When you understand something, you say, I see. But listen to the Talmud Bavli. All the verbs of understanding, kamashmalon, tashma, lo shmi'ale, mipia shmu'a, they are all metaphors of hearing. Judaism is culture of the ear. So that is that cultural difference, number one. Number two, the concept of art itself here is absolutely fundamental. The Greeks engaged in reality by looking at it. The audience in a theatre are not part of the action. Jews understood reality by engaging with and in it. We are not supposed to be an audience watching life. We're supposed to get stuck in. But see, I would add something absolutely more fundamental. Shakespeare, oddly enough, The Merchant of Venice is classified as a what? Anyone know?
Comedy.
It's a comedy. We think it's a tragedy, but actually it's a comedy. But, the concepts of comedy and tragedy are not Jewish concepts. In fact, the Argentinian short story writer, Jorge Luis Borges, wrote a story called Avero's Search. Averro's, the great Islamic intellectual, is translating Aristotle's Poetics, and he comes to the words comedy and tragedy, and he doesn't know how to translate them because they have no meaning for him, and a Hebrew translator would find them equally differently. Do you know something very odd? After all the suffering of 4,000 years of Jewish history, the Hebrew language still does not have a word that means tragedy. Do you ever think about that? Misfortune, ason, yes. But you know what the Hebrew for tragedy is? Tragedia. Go figure. Why? Because, as I say, Judaism is the principal defeat of tragedy in the name of hope. Tragedy can only exist in a hopeless world. And now, finally, I want to add, there can be such a thing as Jewish drama, Jewish art, Jewish novels. And I want to contrast Shylock with two individuals here. Number one, a real stereotype. You want the bad guys in Shemot, who are they? They're in the Egyptians. You want the worst bad guy, it's Pharaoh. You want to see humanity cross that barrier, penetrate stereotypes. Who is the heroine who saves Moses' life, adopts him as a child, and gives him the only name by which he is known in Tanakh? Pharaoh's daughter. So the Tanakh leaps over the stereotypes in a way that Shakespeare, the greatest dramatist who ever lived, cannot leap over the stereotypes. And number two, even when the Torah is giving us a bad guy, I challenge you to read chapter 27 of Bereshit, where Yaakov steals the blessing. Right? So you've got three scenes here: Rivka and Yaakov, Yaakov and Yitzchak, Yitzchak and Esau. Who do your sympathies go to when you read that? Right? You cannot read that chapter other than by reading the Meforshim, but read it without Meforshim. You cannot read that chapter without sympathizing with Esau. It is actually the use of narrative art to engage our sympathies with the one God didn't love and didn't choose. Now, if that isn't ultimate humanitarianism, I don't know what is. Even your enemy, even your worst enemy, is a human being with feelings, who loves his father, who is loved by his father, who is devastated when he loses that one gift of his father's love. And therefore, there can be such a thing as Jewish art. But it has to be a richly generous art, an art lit by the quality of mercy. And I do believe that if you read the great 19th century novelists, whether you read Charles Dickens or you read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, you are reading novels with a very strong moral dimension in which goodness prevails in the end. So it isn't agonistic. It isn't like drama built on conflict. It is built on hope, an ultimate triumph of justice and love. So you will find your models, not in Sophocles and Aeschylus and the Greek tragedians. You will find your models in people like Tolstoy and Dickens, those intensely moral writers who believed in love and justice and hope.
Chief Rabbi, when you mentioned the distinction between misfortune and tragedy, I couldn't help, I'm just saying this by way of conclusion, the great British the great, you know this, Chief Rabbi, the Prime Minister Disraeli, when he was asked the difference between misfortune and tragedy, he said if Gladstone, that was his political rival, if Gladstone tripped and fell in the Thames River, that would be a misfortune, but if someone pulled him out, that would be a tragedy. I think we can say without question that it has been our great good fortune to have you here at the Strauss Center with us today, and please join me in thanking Chief Rabbi.